The preliminary investigation report of Air India Flight AI-171 has revealed some developments that have created a new mystery in the aviation world. Who switched both engines' fuel switches from the run position to the cutoff position just seconds before the crash? When both engines stalled after the fuel was cut off, one pilot asked why the fuel was cut, and the other pilot replied, "I didn't do it." What was the reason that at such a critical moment during takeoff, the fuel switches of not one but both engines were turned off? What about the switches? Was there a fault? Did the pilot do it on purpose, or was it just some malfunction? There have been other similar cases in history where pilots intentionally crashed. What do those incidents and AI-171 have in common? Today, we're going to dive deep and try to understand this issue. It was the morning of June 12, 2025 at Ahmedabad International Airport. A pretty routine day. The air was a bit warm and the sky was perfectly clear. Some planes were boarding passengers at the terminal, while others were taxiing on the runway. Every 5 minutes, a plane was either landing or taking off. Amid this hustle, an Air India Boeing 787 Dreamliner stood parked. Its tail number was VTNB, and the flight number was AI-171. This plane had arrived in Ahmedabad from Delhi just 2 hours ago. Now it was all set to fly from Ahmedabad to London. No one knew that in just a few moments this Dreamliner would make headlines worldwide and leave a mystery in the aviation world. In the cockpit was 56-year-old Captain Sumit Sabrawal, who had a total flying experience of 15,600 hours. They had logged a total of hours, out of which 8,200 hours were on this same Boeing 787. The co-pilot, also called the first officer, was Clive Kundar, aged 32. He had a total experience of 3,400 hours and had flown the Boeing 787 for 1,128 hours. The report stated that both pilots passed the breath analyzer test about an hour before the flight and were found perfectly fit to fly. This same aircraft, VTNB, had operated flight AI-423 from Delhi to Ahmedabad. There was a small technical issue in the previous flight, which the aircraft maintenance engineer troubleshooted and cleared the issue. Now the plane was completely ready for its next flight. Flight AI-171 had a total of 230 passengers. The investigation report stated that 54,200 kilograms of fuel was loaded, and the takeoff weight was 213,400 kilograms, which is well within the normal range for a Boeing 787. There were no signs of any dangerous materials on board. Everything was as per the usual standards. After boarding, according to the Air Traffic Control Tower recordings, the aircraft pushed back from the terminal at 1:13. Requested startup clearance. At 1:33 p.m. and 45 seconds, ATC instructed the aircraft to line up on runway 23. At that time, the wind speed was 6 knots, about 11 kilometers per hour from the east. The weather was perfectly clear with visibility recorded at 6,000 meters. In other words, everything was just right for a normal takeoff. After getting takeoff clearance at 1:37 p.m. and 37 seconds, the pilot pushed the thrust lever forward and started speeding up. Remember, the co-pilot, Clive Kundar, was handling the takeoff on this flight, while Captain Sumit's role was only supposed to be for monitoring. According to the enhanced airborne flight recorder data, the aircraft reached V1 speed at 1:38 p.m. and 33 seconds. That's 153 knots, or 283 kilometers per hour, the speed after which aborting takeoff isn't possible. 2 seconds later, it hit VR speed, which is 155 knots, and then at 1:38 p.m. and 39 seconds, the aircraft took off. Everything up to that point was normal. Even the CCTV footage shows that everything looked normal right up to liftoff, but what happened after that changed everything. It changed. About 3 seconds later, the aircraft reached a speed of 180 knots. This means the engines were still producing thrust even 3 seconds after takeoff. Thanks to the enhanced aircraft flight recorder, it was found that immediately after, the fuel cutoff switches for Engine 1 and Engine 2 were switched from run to cutoff position one after the other, just a second apart. The fuel supply to the engines was now cut off, and their N1 and N2 values started dropping rapidly. In other words, the engine thrust began decreasing quickly. The cockpit voice recorder, which records all sounds in the cockpit. It was heard that right at this point, one pilot asks, "Why did you switch the fuel off?" And the other replies, "I didn't do it." The investigation team still hasn't figured out which pilot asked the question and which one answered. The CCTV footage also shows that just after liftoff, the ram air turbine, also called RAT for short, deploys. This is an emergency power source that automatically kicks in when the engine shuts down. It powers the plane's main electrical system, the RAT's. Deployment is a sign that something unusual definitely happened on the plane. The footage showed the plane rapidly losing altitude, and the EFR data confirmed this because at that time, the N2 values of both engines dropped below their minimum idle speed. At 1:39 p.m. and 5 seconds, the ATC recordings captured a Mayday distress signal. When ATC asked for the call sign, there was no response. ATC also saw the aircraft crash just outside the airport boundary and immediately activated the emergency response. It happened. The aircraft hit the chimney of an Army Medical Corps building about 1,600 meters ahead along runway 23, then crashed into the BJ Medical College hostel. The wreckage spread over an area roughly 1,000 feet long and 400 feet wide from the initial impact point. In this accident, 12 crew members and 229 passengers lost their lives, and 19 people on the ground were also affected. Only one passenger survived, thanks to sitting near the emergency exit by chance. This 15-page preliminary investigation report covers every detail. It's written in detail. After the crash, the flap handle assembly was found in the 5-degree flap position, which is a normal takeoff flap setting, and this was also confirmed by the EFR data. The landing gear lever was found in the down position, and although the thrust lever was quite burned, it was still in the forward position until the crash. The most important thing is that the fuel control switches were found in the run position. This means the pilots had turned the fuel switches back on before the crash. These fuel switches are usually designed so that they can be turned on or off. Both switches have a locking mechanism on the left and right sides. This lock is there to prevent the switch from being accidentally turned on or off. Whenever the pilot needs to open the engine fuel, they have to use both hands. One hand pushes the lock and the other pulls the switch up or down. And that's the surprising part. No one can turn the fuel switch on or off using just one hand, even if they try. Now, if the pilot didn't turn off the switch, as the cockpit voice, if it was heard on the recorder, then who actually switched them off? And even if it happened by mistake, the question is, how did both switches get turned off accidentally? And that too, one after the other. The investigation report also found that both fuel switches were turned off within a second of each other, which looks like a normal human action. Later, both switches were turned back on, but by then, it was too late. According to the investigation report, there was about a 10-second gap between the fuel cutoff and the fuel supply being restarted for Engine 1, and the same for Engine 2. There was about a 14-second delay between the engines shutting down. There's even evidence that both engines had started producing thrust again, but right then, the crash happened. Now, the biggest mystery here is that Flight AI-171 was absolutely perfect until takeoff. Everything was normal, from the engines to the fuel they filled it with. The investigation team even took fuel samples from the tanker that refueled AI-171 and tested them in the lab, but they found nothing wrong. So if everything was perfect, then why were the fuel switches deliberately turned off? They checked if it was done properly or if their locking mechanism was faulty. The report also mentions another important point. In 2018, the FAA issued a special airworthiness information bulletin. This bulletin warned about the possibility of the fuel control switch's locking feature coming off. In other words, the risk of the fuel switch's locking feature failing had been a concern in the aviation industry for some time. This bulletin, also known as an SAIB, was issued after complaints from Boeing 737 operators. This means the problem had been reported before in some Boeing 737 aircraft. It's done. The fuel control switch design, which includes a locking feature, is the same across different Boeing airplane models, including part number 4 TL8373D. This same part was installed on the Air India Flight A I-171 aircraft VTANB. The FAA had warned 7 years ago that some fuel control switches had been installed in a lock-disengaged state. Air India skipped this inspection because it wasn't mandatory, just advice from the FAA. But on the other hand, if we assume that the aircraft's fuel switch locking, the mechanism was faulty and during takeoff, that switch accidentally turned off. But how could such a huge coincidence happen that both switches turned off one after the other, just a second apart? If the pilot did it on purpose, there can only be one reason: suicide. But was it really suicide or not? In 2015, on Germanwings Flight 9525, the co-pilot locked the cockpit door from the inside when the captain went to use the bathroom. The cockpit voice recorder revealed that he deliberately crashed the plane into the Alps. Later, it was found out that the pilot had a history of mental health issues. In 2013, the captain of LAM Mozambique Flight 470 manually set the autopilot to 0 feet when the first officer stepped out of the cockpit. The FDR data confirmed that he did this intentionally, causing the plane to crash. Similarly, in 1999, just before Egypt Air Flight 990 crashed, religious phrases were heard in the cockpit, and then the aircraft's nose went down. According to the Egyptian government, the co-pilot's actions were due to mechanical failure. But the FAA disagreed. A suicide mission was imagined, and in 1997, on Silk Air Flight 185, the pilot manually turned off the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder before crashing the plane by putting it into a nosedive position. Looking at these incidents in history, one common thing found in all these suicide missions was that the pilot stopped responding to ATC. But in the case of Air India 171, which social media is portraying as a suicide mission, it definitely doesn't seem like that, at least according to the investigation so far, because at one point, the pilot, the AKA fuel switches were turned back on. If the intention had been different, they wouldn't have been switched on. Secondly, both pilots were very responsive, and just 2 seconds before the crash, they even sent a distress signal to ATC. And thirdly, just seconds before the crash, the aircraft's nose was seen pitching up, which the flight data also confirmed. This means they were hoping the engines would give thrust again and the plane might climb back up. If it was done deliberately, then what was the point of keeping the elevators in the takeoff position? What's your take on this? Let me know in the comments. Hope you all will like and share this video. See you in the next awesome video.